project that we have, which is about the significance, the importance of NGO data. Our view is that NGOs frequently gather incredibly useful data. Sometimes it's quantitative, but quite often it's qualitative and experiential data that is often missed when it comes to research and an analysis of development. So we think NGOs have a particular role, and their data have a particular role to play in two senses about inclusive development. First of all, bringing NGOs into debates about what inclusive development means and how we might think about implementing that requires us to think beyond academic stakeholders, and I think NGOs are very aware that they have a role in that, and this debate is part of that dialogue that we hope to continue. And the second area where I think this is important is perhaps less well worked. There's much less openness than there should be on the part of academics to the value of NGO data, to thinking about what does it actually mean for research, how can we best make use of it, and how can we work together with NGOs in making the very best use of it and in producing greater inclusivity in development projects and for people in global development. So this is one of a series of workshops that we're hoping to hold on this topic, and we like to thank, while on record, we'd also like to thank the ESRC who are funding this work for us and funded this workshop today and other workshops that we will hold. So that's my welcome, and I'm now going to introduce the first session, which is the session on NGO data and partnerships and valuing those partnerships and that data, academic perspectives.
Programme that, obviously Eugenius has just touched on, that we'll be running through today. There's 2 sessions, and at the end there's a chair in the second one, but there are some programmes around and about. Just a quick one about the IGDC, just about our values, research areas and partners, which are available through the website, and we can check on those. But my open gambit here is a question that's preoccupied us in the IGDC for quite a while, and still is really, which is one of the primary questions, which is what is data, and how do we understand data? So before we progressed in this project, this was one of the first things that we were covering. And understanding the definitions of data varies across disciplines and organisations. To cover this diversity and ensuring interdisciplinarity, we build on definitions of research data as research data as any information collected, stored and processed to produce and validate research results. We therefore consider data to include both qualitative, as Jean said, and quantitative information, a range of formats included but not limited to documents, spreadsheets, censuses, interview notes, films, audio or video files, photographs, contents analysis and questionnaires. But overarching, and the main aim of the project is looking at secondary data. So as we understand secondary data, secondary analysis refers to analysis of existing data which were originally collected for another purpose.
So increasingly, secondary data is being recognised in research and policy arenas as being important in global development, particularly with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's this concern that there's a repetition of work, and using secondary data is a good way of making sure that doesn't happen. So in line with this, we kind of thought of this as an opportunity to consider the potential role of NGO data specifically, because although secondary data has been spoken about a lot, NGO data is still sort of taking a backseat, and classic academic research is still in the forefront of this. So we are sort of exploring the potential of the untapped information collected and held by NGOs, and what role this might play sort of locally, regionally and globally in development research. So from this we came up with a few key research questions. And the sort of main one for this first initial scoping project is, can data held by NGOs inform more inclusive research and policy and development? So can the work that's done in communities or at national level by these different organisations play a role in research and policy? And from that, what are the key opportunities but also the challenges? Because that's one of the reasons it's not maybe utilised as much as it could be, because there are some definite challenges there, which I'm sure a few people will touch on today.
So how did we start this project, and what was our approach? So we are looking at two case studies primarily. The first one is healthcare governance in Eastern and Southern Africa, and the second, disaster risk and resilience in These complement projects that are already ongoing in the IGDC, so they fit in well. With those already. And our findings today, the health governance aspect of this has been done via a scoping review process. So it's looked at globally. It's looked at academic papers which we found via Web of Science and Scopus, and we put in a particular search engine, and these came up with around 3,000 papers to start with. After the first screen, this dropped off to about 300 papers, which involved in the first screen whether they were utilising secondary NGO data, which was in the abstracts and in the references. So down to about 300 papers, and we're currently carrying out the second screen at the minute, which we believe, well, it's nearly finished. We'll have about 150 papers after that. Then the qualitative analysis is going to start of the results that have come up after this screening. We are also a colleague of ours, Alan Souza, who is carrying out fieldwork at the minute in Malawi. He is speaking with representatives from NGOs and other organisations out in Malawi, and we're hoping that this will tie in with the project that Alan's doing as well.
And then the second strand is disaster risk and resilience. This runs parallel to one of the projects led by Henrika Eltink in the IGDC and Peru White on disaster risk and resilience in the Caribbean. So the way that we've approached this one is that we had a trip to Jamaica in October, and I met with representatives there from NGOs, research organisations and universities to kind of discuss the project, see what they thought the main issues are in this area of secondary data and NGO data in particular, and identify opportunities of where this project can benefit people in the field. So some of the key themes that have arisen from different people in the field is that data management needs to be improved in these areas. Sometimes the technology is not quite good enough for collecting and storing the data, but the major one is data accessibility and data sharing. So culturally, most of the people commented that there's this attitude that it's your data. If you collect it, it's yours, and no one else has the right to use it or access it. And that's kind of at odds with what these people think about, and what we think more generally is that it's beneficial to everybody if the data is shared and can be used to inform research and policy. So it's a really rich field, and even though we've just kind of we're in the initial phases, there's definitely a lot there to explore. Yes, there's a couple of quotes here from people, our partners in the Caribbean, so yeah, definitely some interesting things to consider.
So next steps for the project. So after finishing the scope and review that we're doing, we've now carried out for health governance, we're looking at disaster risk and resilience in the Caribbean. That will be starting shortly. This is the first workshop, as Jean mentioned. We will be doing other workshops, and that will be to arrange following on from feedback from today's event, and that's another initiative we need to take forward shortly. So, proposal for the SRC Secondary Data Analysis Initiative, as well to come from this current project. And overarching is obviously building partnerships for future projects with NGOs and other academics as well. So that's where we're up to at the minute.
Yeah, so it'd be great to get ideas and feedback there, and what to go forward, and also technical partnerships to take forward into these proposals.
Yeah, nice to see everybody. I was very happy also with the last presentation because that touched very strongly on the data element, whereas I will be talking more about the value partnerships element of today. Just to maybe have some disclaimers at the beginning. So I'm very interested in non-governmental organizations. I will say something about it in a minute. I look at non-governmental organizations not just in an international development arena, but also at domestic third sector organizations, because I think it has always been quite unhelpful that research on international NGOs or NGOs in the Global South is often separated from the work that we do on the civil society third sector in the Global North. Because as you can imagine, questions around accountability, representation are actually very similar in those different areas. And that's why throughout my research I've been both working on international development as well as on the migration third sector in the Global North, because of course relations between people from the Global North and Global South happen not only in the Global South, but also happen when migrants, for instance, come to the Global North or elsewhere. I've put here lessons and strategies, 3 projects, 3 approaches. So we'll be talking to some of the projects that I've been doing on and slightly with NGOs. People might know when you're on Facebook, right, and you put something about your relationship, you have the option, it's complicated. That's a pretty good description of my relationship to non-governmental organizations. I thought generally it would be helpful to kind of set the scene a little bit in terms of asking ourselves some questions when we talk about collaborations or partnerships between non-governmental organizations and academics. So I'll put some different ones up here. Just very simply, like, what's the object of the research, right? Do we have shared concerns? Do we have disparate concerns? And then, in my particular case, often non-governmental organizations are my object of research. So I'm interested in NGO workers and how they tick, basically. And so you can imagine that the collaborative element is slightly more complicated when NGOs are not just my partners, but also really the thing that I study. But that can of course be very different when you choose another topic which the NGO is working on and you are working on, and these things are very much aligned. What's the position of the researcher? Also, who is the researcher? I mean, what we have seen is that NGOs can be researchers themselves, right? But also we can ask questions about, do we just have one identity? So in my own case, I have volunteered and worked for a number of NGOs, right? And so I'm a researcher as well as somebody identifying with the NGO world. And in one of the projects that I did, I was very much inspired by my own NGO volunteer to set up the project in the first place. What's the goal of the research? Again, are the goals of the NGO compatible, conflicting, disparate, or are they aligned with those of the researcher? And then are the topics and goals, so the things above, are they already predetermined? You know, when we write our project application, are they actually subject to negotiation, or, and that would be of course a further step, right, are they being co-designed? And that's quite different in terms of how you approach those partnerships. So I know of those of you who are from NGOs, I'm sure you get a lot of requests from researchers who say, I'm working on this and I want to talk to you. That's quite different, right, from co-designing work. What relationships are already in place and which ones perhaps only need to be built in the process of the research. And then at which point in the research cycle does the collaboration or exchange take place? Again, this has of course to do with whether you're co-designing or whether you have a separate project. Is it something where you want to increase the impact of your findings and therefore at the very back end of your project you kind of get in touch with the NGOs and you're feeding back your findings? Or is it something that is part of a much more continuous exchange? So, the project that where I was inspired by my own voluntary work at the time for an NGO was a project which was published in this book, Complicit Sisters. It was a project where I was looking into the self-understandings of NGO workers who were supporting women in the Global South or women from the Global South. So this could either be in a domestic migration third sector organization or it could be in an international development organization. And I looked at this from quite a critical perspective, drawing on black feminism, post-colonial theory, critical development studies, to also complicate that relation between the persons who are on the helping side, let's put it very simplistically, and those who are on the receiving side, the beneficiaries of those projects. Because we've seen a lot of those critiques of the intervention of non-governmental organizations. I wanted to look at how the women themselves understood their own position and how they understood the role and their relationship with the women that they sought to support. Now, in the book I've tried to create a nuanced picture of it, and I've also hopefully not exempted myself from the critique. But one of the main kind of guiding questions that I took from Shireen Versakis on the board, and you can see that it has quite a critical perspective already. We need to examine, she says, how we explain to ourselves the social hierarchies that surround us. We need to ask, where am I in this picture? Am I positioning myself as the savior of less fortunate peoples, as the progressive one, as more subordinate, as innocent? These are moves of superiority, and we need to reach beyond them, right? So this can be applied to the NGO worker, but it can equally be applied to the researcher, who can also present him or herself as more innocent than the NGO workers. So I write in the book, in the introduction, that the idea for this study emerged in the context of personal experience and reflections during volunteer work for a UK-based NGO that supports refugees. That was my work at the time. The fact that Shireen Versakis uses the personal pronoun I in the quote above indicates that she does not exempt herself from critical introspection and reflection. I also see this as a duty, being positioned as neither more innocent nor more progressive than the women that I interviewed. Volunteering for different projects of this NGO, I was confronted with my own complicity in perpetuating different structures of inequality, not merely outside the volunteering, but inside the space of doing good. For instance, in one project, we would go out in teams consisting of a refugee and an asylum seeker and one native British person to raise awareness about refugees among, for instance, police officers, firefighters. My whiteness and my Dutch nationality not only meant that I could pass as the British native volunteer, erasing my migrant status, but also that I was ascribed and could revel in the role of the middle-class university expert on the asylum process, reinforcing hierarchies of knowledge. The volunteer refugee colleague accompanying me would often be placed in the role of adding the oral history or local knowledge by speaking about his or her experiences about the asylum process. Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins has described this as the voyeurism common to relationships across power differences. And in another project where I was working with female asylum seekers, I say here that I failed to critically interrogate my colleagues or change the structure of the project when we addressed the women mainly as mothers and facilitated cooking and handicraft activities, even though these drew on and perpetuated gender and racial stereotypes, right? So I myself, of course, consider myself as a complicit sister in this context, and I try to bring that to this research project. Now, when I was doing the project, many of the women NGO workers that I interviewed were very keen to hear about the research findings. They often found that this was a space where they could discuss dilemmas and tensions that there was not a space for to discuss within their NGOs. But of course, a few years later, when I finished my PhD and sent a quick summary, hardly anybody replied. And so, coming out of that, I was thinking, like, how could I do something different in a follow-up project? So, when I then, sorry, this is very small, you don't have to read everything. When I then consequently started working on refugees and migrants who themselves worked in the migration third sector, and what their role was as a kind of mediator and broker, I built into the project workshops where, so one of the things as I communicated, hopefully my findings differently, but I also built in workshops in which we could exchange about those findings, both the refugee frontline workers as well as managers. And I've done a couple of those workshops, and I'm doing some more in the UK at the moment, where we bring together, as I said, mostly refugees who work for the migration third sector, talking about how their knowledge is often undervalued in the organizations that they work for, especially their experiential knowledge. And there are new challenges about creating a safe space for these conversations. We also do now, and I think that was an interesting new step, we do like a follow-up workshop where the organizations that we first invite into our space, we ask them if they could host the workshops in their space. And we see whether after the workshop any of their practices changed, and we kind of ask them to perhaps invite other contexts to broaden the conversation, because I think often, even if we have workshops, we can feel quite inspired and empowered. But then quickly afterwards, normal daily life takes over, we just need to do our work. And we don't really follow up on whether things have changed or not. So this is a quite interactive way of doing it. Currently, I work very differently with them. So, as I said, you see here something about how the relationship already changes. So it's something where I'm in more continuous exchange. I'm not just doing the interviews and then moving out. And also, I build it differently into the research cycle. It's also nice that NGOs start inviting me back and maybe talk to their trustees and stuff. So yeah, that brings a new dimension into it. At the moment, I work on something quite different, namely the claims to rights and protection by Afghan and Iraqi interpreters. You might have heard about them, some military interpreters. But also Iraqis and Afghans who work for development organizations like Save the Children in Afghanistan. They're often seen as traitors, so the Taliban sees them as, you have worked with the infidels. And so they're seeking rights and protection from the Western countries that they work for. Again, I'm looking at their own claims to rights and protection, but I also look at the strategies that our advocates take, which include NGOs. So again, NGOs are partly the object of my study. But there I realized very quickly that when I was doing the research in different countries, that the different NGO efforts were not connected at all. So I managed, I think, there to have a much more early intervention in connecting the efforts in different countries and seeing that also as a way to be useful early on in the research work with it. At the same time, I think there are some perhaps inevitable issues, right? A research project, of course, is not static, but it's always evolving and changeable, which on the one hand gives us opportunities, but at the same time also can create some tensions. Especially around research ethics and relationships, I think we need to think very carefully about the fact that when he's asking me for help, at the same time he's also still the object of my research, right? So what does it mean for our continuous exchange that on the one hand is based on partnership, and at the same time I'm studying him to an extent, and I'm also changing my object of study, namely how people articulate rights and claims to rights and protection, because I'm starting to intervene in the process, the political process that they study. And then finally, of course, time pressures and demands. I just wanted to put it up here because we know we all work according to very different time cycles. So when years later your book comes out, NGOs might have moved on, and I think we need to kind of name those challenges and the ways in which we might sometimes fail or not get it right in order to have an honest conversation about valuing partnerships. Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to the second session. Excuse me, now trying to see it from the point of view of the NGOs and how the view and perspectives for this NGO research and partnerships. We are first going to hear from Ruth Kelly, who has more than 10 years experience working in human rights, development and international economic law and policy. Then we're going to hear from Shavina Sadiq, who has ample experience as well in the health sector, working in the field of advocacy, human rights for women and sexual health promoting for young people, HIV and AIDS awareness. She's led teams and developed programs of safeguarding, health service access solutions, sexual health educational programs. She joined the leprosy mission in 2016 to develop programs advocating for the rights of people affected by leprosy, and to develop partnerships with institutions to raise awareness of leprosy internationally. They are going to talk for around 10-12 minutes each. I'll let you know when we have maybe 3 minutes left, and then we'll have a bit of final questions.
Hi everyone, I'm Shavina, I work for the leprosy mission. So my presentation, before jumping into talking about some of the challenges and some of the interest areas around work with other NGOs and universities, I thought I'd better give you the science bit first, as I like to say. So how many of you in this room have actually heard of leprosy? How many of you work in leprosy? How many of you have studied leprosy? There you go. That's usually the answer I always expect from a lot of academics and a lot of university institutions. So my presentation is going to be about working together to leave no one behind, and it's very important that you remember that title for a reason. So just to kind of give you a bit of background, what is the leprosy mission? known as the TNM. We are an international Christian development organisation which looks at diagnosing, treating and offers specialist care, including reconstructive surgery, to people affected through leprosy, which is the disease. Our aim is to transform and empower those very people that we work with. The Leprosy Mission was founded in 1874, so we have a very, very long history of work with communities affected by leprosy. And as an NGO, we have a charity, we work across 29 countries across Africa and Asia, with the sole purpose of focusing specifically on eradicating the causes and consequences of leprosy. Our vision is very simple. Leprosy defeated, life transformed. Because we know the only way we can make people feel better about themselves is to give them a reason beyond the disease. So that identity is no longer about being a leprosy person, it's about the person. So it's transforming their lives themselves. Leprosy is one of the world's 18 neglected tropical diseases, NGOs, as registered through the World Health Organization. And one of the key things that you find with leprosy, it is a human rights issue. We do find a lot of people, in order to try to eradicate or eliminate the disease in their communities, will set people alive on fire. Just because I think if I burn them, it'll get rid of the disease. It's not. We do find that women aren't treated fairly when it comes forward for the disease treatment. And a lot of the times, depending on the communities where they are, because it is a disease of poverty, women are left behind quite easily. So we have a huge gender issue there as well. The biggest issue we have with leprosy, it is associated with stigma. So it is in the Bible, it is in every kind of religious text you can imagine. There is some form or phrase that mentions leprosy and about, it's God's bad thing, it's an evil spirit coming into you. So it's really deeply ingrained as a disease that we have to challenge ourselves with. The mission itself, we work around medical care, around health awareness, and we do obviously do surgery within many of our hospitals where we work, but we're more than just hospital care, we're about going into the community. We are, as an organisation, about working bottom up. We work with the people so they themselves can then keep working forward, rather than depending on governments and us going in there all the time to do the work for the people. So the science bit, as I like to say. So leprosy is a chronic infectious disease caused by the microbacterium leprae, which is a little rod, fast bacilli, if you're looking at a telescope. It does affect the skin, the periphery nerves, and basically it's a sensation loss. So when anyone is diagnosed with leprosy, they will have a sensation loss. Typically with a lot of the communities where we work, there will be farming communities, there will be communities who don't have good access to healthcare. They might notice a little skin patch, which is typical common trait of leprosy, won't think anything of it. They might go to the fields, want to do some work, might not be able to quite feel the sensation of holding the tools in their hands, won't think anything of it until it starts to get worse and their fingers start to thaw in or affects their legs. So it's one of those diseases that even though it is quite slow growing, a lot of people tend to just ignore the signs straight away for it. Leprosy is a disease of poverty. You will find it quite highly endemic amongst the poor communities across Africa and Asia, and it is most importantly a curable and treatable disease. I think this is one of the key things why as an organisation we work bottom up. It is to make people aware that you can get treatment for it, and it is curable. The sooner you get treatment, the less likely you can have a disability as a result of it. So, as part of the fellowship, 29 countries, Leprosy Mission England and Wales is one of those country states. We work across these countries in Africa and Asia, where we deliver and develop projects within communities and work quite closely with the governments. As the Leprosy Mission England and Wales, we actually work across 16 of the 17 SDGs. The only one we don't do is kind of underwater. Unfortunately, leprosy isn't found underwater yet, but I'll open my hands to that one if anyone finds it great. But we work across 60 of the S17. And why am I mentioning this? Because like any other INGO, we have to kind of work towards international goals. So in order to keep that recognition alive and in order to make people aware that this disease is there, so here's what we're working towards. So the Leprosy Mission, we have 3 key focus areas within the Leprosy Mission. One of them is around zero transmission. So every 2 minutes, someone is diagnosed with leprosy. Every 2 minutes, someone is diagnosed with leprosy. And 1 in 10 of those people diagnosed are children, and when we're talking children under the age of 12. So they will end up coming to see a lot of our clinical experts once the disease is actually set in. And so their fingers have started clawing, they've ended up with early signs of a form of disability. So that is the worst kind of thing, so we tend to find. And all globally, according to the World Health Organization, we have just over 200,000 new cases of leprosy reported. That was in 2017, and the numbers still keep growing. And one of the reasons why they keep growing is because leprosy as a bacterium takes up to 40 years to come forward, to show itself, manifest itself. So I could be carrying leprosy all my life, and then out of the blue, one day, happily married, children are growing up, I suddenly start seeing the signs of leprosy. My instinct isn't going to be, oh, I've got leprosy, I'll be thinking it's age. But once I'm diagnosed, once I'm told I've got leprosy, that is when the whole stigma kicks in, and that is when you find people are rejected within communities, people are actually thrown out of families, and the whole cycle of what comes associated with leprosy comes into it. The second area of research that Leprosy Mission are interested in is about zero disabilities, and it's to prevent disabilities from setting in. The sooner you access treatment, the quicker it will be to get rid of that disability. And just over 16,000 girls and boys were diagnosed with leprosy in 2017, and 39% of those newly diagnosed were obviously for girls or women, and the reason being because depending on the communities where we work, women are the last to get the treatment. Furthermore, the treatment for leprosy across any of our countries is too far away. Women will not travel 6 to 8 hours to access a health centre, let alone see a doctor. They are the home carers, so why on earth would they need that treatment? So that is a huge thing. Another aspect that we'll have a huge case of, leprosy is free treatment. It's free treatment according to the World Health Organization. But debilitating that information down to communities, it's very difficult. So communities still think to get any treatment you have to pay for it. You don't. It is free access. The third area we work on is around zero discrimination. Very importantly, there are over 157 laws in place that discriminate against people affected by leprosy. One such example is, if I give you India for instance, there are quite a lot of laws there which state that if you have leprosy, your right in a marriage will be annulled. So you as an individual, your marriage will be annulled, if you own land, it will be taken off you automatically, you will be not eligible to any benefits, let alone any healthcare, and you may be sent to a mental institution, because that is how you treat leprosy. You give someone mental health shots and therapy. Not the case. So there's a lot of these old mythical laws that are still around and have been ingrained but have barely been challenged. So, working in partnership. Remember my title, Working, Leaving No One Behind? Well, that is actually a title that was formed in 2012 from part of the London Declaration, which was around neglected tropical diseases, which brought together institutions, NGOs, pharmaceuticals, coming together to say how is it that we are going to fight all the neglected tropical disease, of which leprosy is one, globally. And the decision was we need to work together. We need to make sure no one is left behind by working together. An NGO cannot do everything. It needs the support of institutions of pharmaceuticals and other healthcare providers. So working together with other NGOs and other CSOs as well. Some of the key things that were found working together, especially around research, with other NGOs, and I'm just going to pick on some of them. Working with other NGOs who might not be specifically leprosy focused, they might be focused on eye care, WASH or anything. It's reaching out to wider communities. As a leprosy organisation, we only go so far. They may have a deeper reach somewhere else, so we'll be able to work jointly together and probably raise the awareness of WASH and fighting through different stigmas and community education. One of the greatest challenges that we tend to have is, which is mostly picked up, is around data collection not being shared. Typically, even within NGO organisations, when we work in partnership, it's a case of, it's my data, it's not yours. It's about my disease, not about your disease. At the end of the day, we are there working with the same community, and a lot of the times, a lot of neglected tropical diseases, leprosy as well, are comorbid with other diseases. So just because you have leprosy does not prevent you from having other diseases. And a lot of the times that is the case. So why can't we share that data? It becomes a huge issue for us. Working with local governments. The greatest challenge, the greatest opportunity we have is to have the buy-in support from governments on the programmes we deliver. The challenge we have within leprosy is in 1995, it was globally declared eliminated. So any government now that turns around and says we still have leprosy in our country, it's like kind of saying egg on your face. Ha ha, how have you got that? And one of the ways we kind of work with governments to say is, okay, you've got this issue, let's work together and let's try to decrease those numbers again. So it's kind of getting a government buy-in to say, you're not by yourself, we acknowledge what you've been trying to do, let's work together, let's support each other and raise the awareness. It also means in turn, for us as a leprosy mission, we can also access their health staff, raise awareness, make them more aware of how to diagnose and treat leprosy. So get rid of their own personal stigmas around treating a disease that they might feel themselves. Some of the greatest challenges that we do have is, in a lot of countries, especially in Africa, it's staff retention. We tend to find, especially when we're doing kind of data collection, there's a 2-year or 1-year staff changeover, and then things keep moving around, and then things are dropped, and then staff need to be retrained. And by the time you kind of keep going through the cycle, that's a whole funding phase, a 3-year funding phase of a project. So that is a huge issue that we tend to have a problem with. One of the other issues that we have, and I'm going to pick on, is around the local bureaucracy and the ownership of data. For a lot of countries where we work, even if we work closely with a lot of governments, the issue is if the government staff were part of collecting that data, just by being there, it's our data, it's their data. And for us to share it or access it with anyone else, we need to have written permissions from the ministries, just so that we can have that piece of data to be able to advocate for leprosy and to be able to advocate for more funding as well. Working with universities, obviously for us as an organisation, we work quite closely with a lot of universities across the UK and Europe, mostly because the more people that are aware of leprosy and the more work that's published is brilliant. Yeah? One of the biggest challenges we have in the leprosy world is that actually our talent, dare I say, is getting old and moving, there's not enough new knowledge coming through. So the more people that can be able to be more involved in research and leprosy, the more awareness we're raising out there. One of the key things with working with universities is they can support us to validate the impact of the work we do. A lot of the research, before any project even starts, we always collect baseline data, mid-year data, and data, every kind of data you can imagine. Having universities be part of that collection process and start-off process gives us ample reason to say, has this actually worked? We, as an organisation, can see the end result, but realistically, has it actually worked? What has been the longer-term impact? Is this something we can argue and keep supporting this disease and raising funds for it? Many UK institutions obviously require UK universities to work with low middle-income countries and NGOs. Leprosy works across low middle-income countries. We work across, and yet sometimes one of the biggest things is we have to actually approach universities to say, hey, there's us as well. So we typically, as a disease, get kind of sidelined through. A couple of challenges that we've had. It's a big challenge because obviously we are an organisation, as I've mentioned, that works bottom up. And our bottom up approach is we really want our beneficiaries to have their say. We really want the beneficiaries to take the lead on helping some of the researchers get the information they require. And a lot of the times experience has shown us that sometimes researchers come with their own agenda. And we're not interested in you, beneficiary. You have your health system. You stay there. And there's this kind of disrespect there. So we have to work quite closely with a lot of universities to say, look, you need to respect the people that we're serving, because at the end of the day, this project is for them. It's not for you, it has to be involving them as well. Another issue we have is working with a few universities, it's a whole thing about let's do a pilot research first. And that is solely because the funding can be prolonged further. So let's do the foundation stage and let's do the next stage, and then we'll go on to the big research. That is probably looking at, 12 years down the line? We've only got funding for a project for 3 years. We don't have 12 years in the line. So, it's the whole thing about you need to be able to look carefully at what the work it is that we offer and how it is that we can work together collaboratively. And last comment I want to make is around the ownership of data. client versus researcher. A lot of the time, because we are the leprosy mission, we will say, as an organisation, we need to work jointly together to own that data. It shouldn't just belong to the university, because a lot of our own staff, a lot of our own beneficiaries help to collect that data, so it should belong to us. And a lot of the times that we find a lot of universities and researchers say, no, it's only mine and nobody else's. And that makes it very challenging, very difficult. So just to kind of pick on some of the things we can learn on, typically, whenever we work with any universities or any NGOs, we tend to put a memorandum of understanding in place. One of the key learnings we've realised is that memorandum of understanding needs to be reviewed more often than what is typically practiced. And one of the reasons being because if there is an issue of culture or clashes with staff, with beneficiaries, with researcher, we should be able to stop any kind of this hurt feeling or your disrespect feeling coming through and be able to work with that. And certainly making clear where data should be shared equally. I think the most important thing just to mention is what we can learn is beneficiaries have a voice. As I have said, we are a ground-up organisation. We have many forums, collectively groups of people affected by leprosy who are now constituted as an organisation themselves, who can join in to share their experiences, who can give you case studies, who can help you collect data. They are there. Don't just ignore them, but do acknowledge them. And that is one of the things that I would really emphasise, is acknowledging a lot of the people that help in the process of research. Thank you.
So what we have here are 3 questions that we would like you to consider in small groups.
We spoke about the challenges that we had about for sharing the data, and we saw there were a lot of differences within disciplines. So for example, I think in terms of politics, it's easier to share the data, whereas in health, for example, you need to have a ethics agreement that is specific for that kind of data, or also in what you're going to use the data for.
It may be an ideal scenario. You would start by going to an NGO and work with them and say, what kind of data do you have, and then develop a project around that. But that's not usually the way things work, and that's where there's a lot of tension between academics then.
As academics, sometimes we need to look at NGOs in a more critical eye, and making that distinction clear as observing them as objects of study, but being very clear on the sort of conditions of that relationship.
If you are collecting your own data, you fill an ethics form, and those people give consent for your project. But what if you then use other people's work where the issue there is less ethics but ethical? So can we do it? Can we use people's work that was collected for one purpose, maybe even a long time ago, but can you still reuse it? So an ethical issue here.
So thank you for all your contributions to the discussions. It's been really helpful. So I was just going to make a few kind of observations around some of these questions before wrapping up. So firstly, about partnerships, and it's been discussed about the need for partnerships and clear kind of understanding around the rules with which organisations are kind of sharing information and collaborating with each other. And I think that, going back to some of the initial presentations, I think there's an increased understanding among academics that there needs to be more equitable sharing of ideas and more equitable treatment of partners, non-academic partners. Obviously, this awareness doesn't always move into best practice, but I think increasingly it is doing so. But what I think is being left behind here is the ethics of this. And in particularly when you look at partnership agreements that are made, there's almost nothing about the actual ethics. There might be something about IP, but there's virtually nothing ever written in them about ethics of how to use data, how to reuse data, and all that sort of thing. And I think that feeds on to the second point, which is about responsibilities that academics have. I think here there's responsibilities that academics have towards the NGO partners they're working with, but also when we think about reusing data, especially when the data are essentially to do with people and people's behaviour, etc., then we also have responsibilities to those people, participants initially, who were involved and contributing essentially their kind of life and behaviour, etc., to this wider process. And I think that often gets left behind, particularly when we're using data that may have been kind of through several degrees of processing. Essentially, you start to lose sight of the individuals behind that data. So even if you're operating within certain ethical guidelines, I think as researchers that we have a responsibility to think really carefully about how we're using those data, the type of level of resolution we're analysing these data at. And even if we're following best practice, is it actually still ethical? Are we facing up to our responsibilities? And then the final point was about the context in which the data are often collected. So obviously, when we're reusing data especially, it's important to understand different contexts. So we may be pooling data from different NGOs that may be operating in a similar country or whatever, but the context in which they collect data might be quite different. And some NGOs, although I think this will be true of maybe some of the smaller, more advocacy-based NGOs, often they'll start from a point of view that they want to promote a certain agenda, and they'll collect data in order to promote that agenda. They won't necessarily collect data objectively. Now, I certainly wouldn't claim that scientists or social scientists collect data objectively, because I don't think anyone ever collects data and certainly doesn't analyse it in a truly objective way. But I say there is a bit of a spectrum of objectivity and subjectivity. So when we're thinking about reusing data, we need to understand that context quite carefully and have to face up to the fact that sometimes if we're doing some meta-analysis of data across NGOs, we may come up with conclusions that some of those NGOs might not be very comfortable with. And we have to think that might actually happen, and what are we going to do in those situations? So we have to think this process through really carefully. And I think we have made quite a lot of progress in terms of thinking about ways in which we can operate in terms of best practice. Many types of things in which we do our research, and perhaps we need to spend a bit of attention thinking about how we can actually start to develop some guidelines maybe that we can start to follow in terms of data reuse and focusing on ethics and responsibilities of that. So those are the kind of main observations that I wanted to make. I wanted to say finally, thank you especially to Alice and Matt for putting this together. It's been a really good event. You started it off really well, and we've got loads to think about as we go and take all that analysis of all the literature that you've been downloading. So that's going to be really, really helpful, some of these questions, to help us frame some of those larger questions, and then as we move forward into proposals. And we haven't quite decided whether we're going to have a second workshop at some point, but if you're interested in having a second workshop along these themes, or think there's other ways in which we